we're in a wealthy, developed economy, we might consider after a shock, do we need quantitative easing? How do we, can we do a big fiscal boost? Faced with COVID, developed countries spent 25% of their GDP, 25% of their GDP on dealing with COVID. Many developing countries spent 2% of their GDP. And so debt has become the shock absorber in emerging markets and developing countries. Debt is a shock absorber. Debt is rising to intolerable levels. A debt crisis is beckoning. And the same countries suffering this debt crisis are the very same countries the planet needs to be investing in the green transformation. The rich countries have used up almost 70% of our carbon budget. We've only actually got 15% left. So unless we enter the green transformation, the whole world, the whole planet, poor and rich countries alike, are going to suffer the consequences of hitting those planetary limits. And we've already seen a taste of those limits last year with record heat waves, record flooding, the tragedy of Pakistan, 33 million people homeless, 27,000 schools underwater. That is the future we must think and see and not just imagine if we do not act. But how will these countries enter the green transformation? It costs money. It's a burden on development. Why is it a burden on development? Many of the green transformation things we're talking about, whether it's moving in the energy transformation, whether it's creating some of the life economies and life zones of activity that we've been talking about here, the Indian G20. Many of these things have a revenue attached, but they require significant investment. And the investment is extremely expensive. There are tremendous risk premiums around this investment. The same solar farm in Germany, the cost of capital is around 2 to 3%. That solar farm in India, the cost of capital is 10%. In South Africa, it's 15%. In Zambia, it's 25%. That's why it's not happening. That's why the green transformation is not happening with the consequences, the planetary consequences we talked about. And the bulk of that capital cost is a macro risk problem. And that's not the thing being addressed, because I go back to the earlier conceit. The earlier conceit that all you need is better policies and the private sector will come and do development for you has meant that the IFIs and others have been focused on risk reduction around policy, around the sector, around projects, risk mitigation around projects. 75% of the risk premium is a currency risk, is a country risk, not a risk that any of these things can do. And that is why the private sector is not coming. And so let me conclude by saying this is the problem. This is the consequences of us not doing something about it. What future can we imagine if the world behaved as if there was one earth and one family and one future? I believe there's a system of finance that gets us to the $2 trillion a year we need. A system of finance, starting off at the core with the multilateral development banks. We need around $250 billion a year to be invested in resilience, making our economies more resilient. And that is also about investing in natural capital. Resilience and natural capital will bring savings in the future. We can borrow for that, but we need to make our countries resilient today, not in 20 years' time. So we need to borrow huge amounts of money for resilience, and we can't do it with commercial rates of borrowing. We need a new instrument, super long-term borrowing at very low costs, at the same borrowing costs of a AAA development bank. But 50-year debt, not 10-year debt. We're building resilience for the future. 50-year debt, 100-year debt, and that will allow us to be resilient. And the MDBs can lend $250 billion more. if they follow the CAF review of the G20 Working Party, if they make their callable capital really callable, if they use diverted SDRs, they can free up headroom of $1 trillion. This is the moment we need to grasp that $1 trillion and invest it in a more resilient and sustainable future. But we also need a transition, a green transition, in things that have revenues attached, which the private sector can do, but not with these risk premiums. We need a new agency. And I believe the Indian G20 should help us launch a new agency whose purpose is to guarantee currency and country risk, allowing the private sector to treat a solar farm in South Africa as the same risks as a solar farm in India, or a solar farm in Germany is the same risks as a solar farm in India or Zambia or Vietnam or anywhere else. We believe that using MDB's capital, liquidity, SDRs, diversification, and scale, we can reduce those risk premiums. And the final thing is we need money for things for which there's no revenues attached, for which there's no savings to be had. Parts of that just transition requires actual grant money. And we've reduced the amount of grant money you need because we've got the MDBs lending, we've got the private sector involved, but we still need an element of grant money, of new additional resources. Because overseas development assistance, it is not going up, it is shrinking. It's being double counted. We need new additional resources. We need to tap into the fact that the fossil fuel industry made $4 trillion last year, that the finance industry trading many of short-term activity and not focused on the life future of our economy is making excessive profits. Small green financial transaction taxes, fossil fuel taxes will fund those grants that we need. So let me end by thanking you for listening to me, for saying that we need a new system of finance. That new system of finance that diverts different sources of finance for different activities, gets the MDBs playing a critical role in resilience, gets the private sector working, unblocking those sources of funding, getting new additional revenues. That is what we need for the future, and without that, the consequences are severe. The very multilateral system, if it fails today, if it fails countries today, fails developing countries today, people will start wondering, what is the point of it at all? Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed, sir, for a very significant, insightful, and thought-provoking keynote address. With that, ladies and gentlemen, we now move on to the panel discussion on LiFE, an engine for growth, lifestyle for environment. This session, ladies and gentlemen, is going to be moderated by, so let me now invite our moderator on stage as well as our eminent panelists. May I first invite Professor Sachin Chaturvedi, our moderator for this panel. May I request you to please help me welcome him on stage. He is currently, thank you very much, sir, welcome, Director General at the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, New Delhi. And he works on issues related to development economics, involving development finance, SDGs, and South-South cooperation, apart from trade, investment, and innovation linkages, with special focus on WTO. Currently, he's also Vice Chairman, Atal Bihari Vajpayee Institute of Good Governance and Policy Analysis, and ex-officio Vice Chairman of Madhya Pradesh State Policy and Planning Commission, and he is also Member Board of Governors, Reserve Bank of India. Welcome again, sir. Now, may I invite our eminent panelists on stage, Mr. Hirad Sabeti, co-founder and CEO of the Fourth Sector Group, Washington, D.C. Here he is, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Sabeti is devoted to pursuing systemic solutions to complex social, environmental, and economic challenges. He's co-founder and CEO of the Fourth Sector Group, 4SG, a multi-stakeholder collaborative platform, which is dedicated to accelerating the growth of the fourth sector globally. Mr. Sabeti has served on advisory bodies for a number of entities, including the Aspen Institute's Intersectoral Relations Initiative, the Clinton Global Initiative, the World Economic Forum Future Council on International Governance, Public-Private Cooperation, and Sustainable Development, to name a few. Welcome, sir. May I now invite Dr. Fahmida Khatoon, the Executive Director at the Center for Policy Dialogue, Bangladesh. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome the lady. Dr. Khatoon is a member of the panel of economists for the 8th five-year plan between 2021 to 25 formed by Bangladesh Planning Commission. She is also a member of the advisory committee for the National Human Development Report to be prepared by the Economic Relations Division, Government of Bangladesh. She was a director of Janata Bank Limited, the second largest state-owned bank of Bangladesh, and a director of the SME Foundation of Bangladesh. Dr. Fehmida Khatoon has undertaken research for several international organizations. Welcome, ma'am. May I now invite Dr. R. Balasubramaniam, the full-time member HR in the Capacity Building Commission of the Government of India. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome him. Welcome, sir. Dr. Balasubramaniam is a development scholar, author, public policy advocate, leadership trainer, known for his pioneering development work with rural and tribal people in Karnataka, India. He founded the Swami Vivekananda Youth Movement, a development organization based in Saragur when he was 19. After spending 26 years in development work amongst rural and tribal people, he pursued academic degrees in leadership, organizational development, and public policy. Warm welcome once again, sir. May I now invite Ms. Celeste Cristina Badaro, a Brazilian diplomat. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Warm welcome to you. She's currently working at the G20 coordination in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She has experience in economic affairs, development cooperation, tax negotiations, environment, and consular affairs. And she has had postings at the Brazilian embassies in Amman and Oslo. And she has a bachelor's degree on economics with the Federal University of and International Relations Catholic University as well of Minagere. Warm welcome once again to all of you. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm now going to request our moderator to please take over the proceedings, Professor Sachin Chaturvedi. Sir.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for this very generous introduction for the panel and for having us here to discuss this whole concept that has been so well articulated in the keynote address by Professor Avinash in terms of LiFE engine for economic growth and what he referred in terms of a new paradigm that we need for economic development and for us to take forward this challenge in a meaningful manner in a way that countries and G20 may address. I think it's important for us to explore different facets of this development. And I'm so glad that I have extremely accomplished panel today. I would very much like to mention in terms of how we are thinking in terms of this transition, in what way we can think in terms of the new development paradigm and particularly the recent crisis, all of that so well explained by our keynote speaker today. I think we have a context here and G20 has a role to perform, to take that forward in terms of how countries are actually taking forward the ideas, the strategies, and also defining the scope both for international financial institutions, individual behavior, but also strategizing through the international institutions that are there. Couple of questions that are there in my mind, and I think all of us have also been thinking in terms of how exactly LiFE would manifest itself. It would manifest itself through the action strategies. It would manifest itself through the systemic transition that need. And that systemic transition in several cases is actually systemic transformation. And when we talk about this transition and transformation, we need to see what kind of resources we are talking of. Who is financing this transition or transformation? In what way that systemic transition or transformation is going to get itself in form of revenue mobilization, in terms of resource mobilization through the regional development institutions, and also trying to capture that to have some benchmarks, to have some reference lines. The panel that we have here is extremely accomplished in terms of, as was so generously introduced, in terms of how their national development strategies, in terms of both industrial and economic policy, but also in terms of environmental policy, how they are unfolding and in what way we can think in terms of identifying the possibilities that are there, both for our participation, for our contribution, and also for setting the international development agenda, which now after collapse of the respective growth strategies, which largely came up, and as our Joint Secretary, Ms. Enam Gambhir mentioned, in terms of the new narratives that are required. And that, I think, is absolutely essential for us to capture what way forward. And this is time and again with national experiences that we are seeing across, and also for countries which are on the brink of their transition from LDC status to the developing country status. And that would require resources. Countries that are on the coastline, they would require resources. Countries that are having huge challenges in terms of water security and other lifestyle related challenges that we have posed for ourselves, they would require some response. So from that perspective, the questions that I have in terms of what plans and what principles we need, what kind of incentivization models that are needed, and what kind of connection the LiFE process may have with circularity, and in what way we can absorb it largely within this. And within SDGs, if you see SDG 10, SDG 12, you find a direct connect of the process of life. The strategy is also in terms of how do we take forward, and in what way the localization strategy, the local content, and local strategies that are needed for taking the agenda forward would be helping. So with this sort of context setting, I would very much like to begin with my dear friend Hirad, in terms of how he looks at this whole process, both as LiFE, as engine of growth. But Hirad, it is also, I think, important for us to see what kind of systemic transition we are talking about. When we think in terms of LiFE and its several facets, what systemic contribution it can bring in, and how you see in terms of concept of LiFE setting the agenda for the systemic transition. So what we would do is to have first round of 2 minutes each of our panel. I would have second round, and my idea is that I close with 1 minute each as closing remark by our speakers. So I'm little ambitious with 3 rounds, though I was advised to have 1, and then we ended up with 2. So Hirad, I begin with you, 2 minutes, and that's the question. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Sachinji, and grateful to RIS and TERI and the co-chairs for the invitation to be here and for putting on this event. In 2 minutes, I guess what I can think to say is, I would go to first principles. What is LiFE a response to? LiFE is a response to a default economic model that every single one of us were born into. It existed before we were born. And it was designed, in fact, quite some time ago. And in its design are a whole bunch of built-in trade-offs or contradictions or paradoxes. So we have the engine of the economy is business, and business, the way it's conducted the world over, is in many ways very extractive and externalizing of social and environmental costs. But that is what we grow when we talk about growth. When we talk about GDP growth, we're growing what is fundamentally an extractive of people and planet model of enterprise and job creation and prosperity creation. So we have got to figure out some way to switch from what is really a suicide economy to a LiFE economy, which is a fundamentally different architecture. It's a fundamentally different way of thinking about organizing economic activity, I think, at the very base, at the root. So what does a business look like? What does agriculture look like? What does healthcare look like? What does education or infrastructure look like if the purpose of the enterprise is to optimize benefits for all of its stakeholders, to create value for people and planet, rather than extract profit from people and planet? That's a fundamentally different archetype of business. And I passed 3 elephants on the way from the airport here the other day, and it made me think about the giant elephant that's in these kinds of rooms all the time. We keep trying to figure out some way to take the default development strategy, which is growing and externalizing an extractive economic model, and through some patchwork of regulation and policy and financial engineering, and marketing campaigns and to get consumers to act differently. Through this incremental patchwork, we try to mitigate the harms it's creating. But you know, the Sustainable Development Goals have only been around since 2015. And they're still not the dominant way any country runs their economy. There is a default development goals that existed before that and are still the dominant development goal, which is growing GDP and growing this extractive model. So if we want to solve for the SDGs, we have to think about a completely alternative model to enterprise and investment and growth that is fundamentally not about extraction from people and planet, but about creating value for people and planet. And to me, the good news is that that model exists and it's thriving. I have a question for all of you. How many of you are aware of a legal framework that has been passed in any country in the last, say, 15, 20 years that recognizes a different model of business that is pro-life, that's pro-social or pro-environmental? How many of you are aware of such legal forms? Okay, this is the other elephant in the room. 17 of the G20 countries at least have passed new legal forms. Some call them social cooperatives, some call them social economy, social enterprise. There's a wide range of models. There's a whole new life economy that's been trying to be born for decades. There are entrepreneurs who are pursuing social aims, investors who are pursuing impact, consumers who are conscious about their choice making. And these are not small numbers. And there's 40 million startup social purpose businesses around the world each year. So for me, the first principle is recognizing what is the paradigm we're moving away from, the suicide economy, and then recognizing that the life economy is in fact here and present, and it's trying to take form, and it needs more attention and more focus. And that's, I think, getting to your later question about structural reforms.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Heath. And I think it's important for us to realize several sort of different lexicons that we are using in development literature, and sometimes we get lost with that. And as Heath rightly pointed out, a large number of countries within G20, they have evolved some framework. So I think it's important for us to recognize. Let me now go to my another very dear friend, Famida Khatun. Famida has been leading development agenda, particularly SDGs in Bangladesh. Bangladesh is also grappling with the major challenge of climate crisis. So how you see, Famida ji, in terms of LiFE coming in and bridging the crucial gap and the conceptual framework, and also in terms of future agenda, when we talk about development debates or we talk about the climate change debate, particularly in context of Bangladesh, how you think that can help in taking us forward?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Sachin. I'm really honored and privileged to be here. And you have rightly pointed out that Bangladesh is grappling with the impact of climate change, like many other developing countries and LDCs. Now, as we always say that, and also the SDGs have 3 pillars of growth or advancement, sustainable development, like economic, social, and environmental. So economic growth is crucial for employment generation, from income generation to reduce poverty. But then it is not automatic that the economic growth will also lead to social development and environmental development. So that's why we have seen at the global scale also that many countries, including the developed countries, economic growth could not reduce the inequality. In fact, when we are talking about the inequality reduction and the sustainable development goals, when those were formulated, we had to remember that during the MDGs, the missing link was the reduction of inequality. Though in absolute numbers, poverty might have reduced, but we could not do quite well in terms of inequality reduction. Similarly, environmental degradation has also not been addressed adequately. In fact, when you talk about economic growth, then the traditional measure of GDP is that you can have growth, high growth, by destroying the environment, by destroying the ecosystem, biodiversity, and many other things. So because GDP is calculated on the basis of transactions in the market, which brings value, but we forget the intrinsic value of the environment. So these problems, I think it's not only exclusive to Bangladesh, but also at the global level. But why it's important for countries like Bangladesh? Because it is an LDC, as you have rightly mentioned, and it is also a resource poor country, and it has large population. So that's why when there is climate disasters, the number or the scale of disaster, human fatality is much more larger than countries which have lower population. So I think I'll just touch upon the policy issues because your questions also focus on that. What kind of policies? Since I'm an economist, I would look at the economic point of view. I think here both fiscal policy and monetary policy have very important role, and these also have to be coordinated with other sectoral policies like trade policies, industrial policy, agriculture policy, and all these. Fiscal policy, just 2-3 points that for social inequality, for social development, taxation, progressive taxation, just taxation is a measure to reduce inequality through domestic resource mobilization, through effective taxation, tax mobilization. The government has fiscal space for investment in infrastructure, but that is not only on physical infrastructure, but also software infrastructure, health, education, social development, all this. And another also that traditional way of resource mobilization through taxation, in addition to that, we also have to think of new ones, which many developed countries have already pursuing, that is like polluters pay principle. On the basis of that, carbon taxation is another way. And also that incentives, providing incentives to the new renewable energy, for example, or the cleaner initiatives. So in many developing countries and LDCs, there are subsidies, even in Bangladesh. But then it is not feasible to continue the subsidies. So withdraw those subsidies from those which are going across the society, irrespective of the income of the recipients, but then targeted ones which are essential for the survival. For example, in case of Bangladesh, it is agriculture sector because it is the source of food security. So if we can have some incentive for renewable energy in the agriculture sector, that will be one way to make transition. But gradually we can withdraw it. I'll just touch upon the monetary policy since I have mentioned that here again, that through the central banks they have the tools in their hand. Nowadays, we are, when we are facing high inflationary pressure, and the poorest ones and marginalized people are the most vulnerable victims of this high inflationary measure. So through interest rate mechanism, you can address, we can reduce the pressure, and also through interest rate, through access to finance, making easy the finance, easy finance through concessional rates or zero interest rate for those which sectors are green, and particularly for the smaller ones, small and medium enterprises who have been actually started to face the difficulties since COVID period. Now with the war, it has accentuated. So these are the two, policy mechanisms. There are many components of this, but I have just touched upon. So what my message is that it is, since you have also mentioned that it is a comprehensive issue. We should not look at this as a silo, and it is not an issue of the Ministry of Environment only. It is also not an issue of the government only. It is an issue of the people and citizens who are at the grassroots. And as you have mentioned that we have the citizens platform on SDGs, where we have seen thousands of NGOs who are working at the grassroots level. They are actually promoting the implementation of the SDGs and through their localized knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Dr. Fahmida. Let me turn to Dr. Balasubramaniam. Baluji, as we call you, guru for our development students here in India, the development community. As Dr. Fahmida Khatun mentioned, individual behavior is important, and some nudging through several instruments that she just now mentioned are important, and they would go a long way. I want to ask you, being a economic development theorist and practitioner, how you see a possibility of us evolving an integrated development framework, outcome of which is the lifestyle that naturally promotes not only through incentivization or penalization, as Dr. Famida mentioned, but in terms of natural outcome of our development strategy, how is that possible? Over to you.
Thanks, Sachin. I would like to start off with what Einstein said. You really can't solve a problem from the same space in which you created it. And we seem to be focusing on solving this problem from that space. That's my concern. So when I think the word itself, and beyond the semantics, when you say life economy, our focus seems to be on the economy part of it. I think we got to start focusing on the life part of it. And to me, what is so special about this term is life makes it personal. It makes it my responsibility, like what Famida was talking. It's very intimate. So I'm going to possibly share thoughts from how a person on the grassroots would see it, and for whom it really matters, the Antyodaya concept that we speak of in India. How does it look for him? I think it has to be a new paradigm, like Professor Avinash said. It's not about just, and paradigm is the different way of thinking itself. And how would I think about it? It's about the kind of investments we make. It's not the financial investments we make. And we got to be a little more clear about it. It's going to be the investments we make on building human capital. It's going to be the investments you're going to be making on building social capital. And then these are going to have economic consequences, which is going to be the life economy. So if we're looking for outcome of life, we got to redefine where our investments are going to go, put it on human and social capital. And that means we're starting off with a different definition of development itself. Development is not the way we see things around us, but development is more about a constant expansion of human capabilities. And in that perspective, for me, human capital would mean what would actually, my expanding my capabilities in the physical, cognitive, emotional, and spiritual domains that actually gives me the agency to lead and sustain life. And that's the personalization I spoke. Now, if I don't take on the responsibility and the agency to lead and sustain life, sustainable development goal is going to be a myth. It's only going to be a slogan or a statement that we all keep giving each other in these workshops and conferences, but we don't give the responsibility to the individual to actually act on it. And building that, in making that investment is a framework. So it's fundamentally a shift in thinking, which means everything else changes. The definitions change, the lexicon changes, the taxonomy of words that we use to describe these things also changes. And it has to be integrated. And we need to understand it has to be a systems approach. You can't exclude anybody from this process. That's not the responsibility of the state alone. All the players, major players of development, like the state, the citizens and community groups, the civil society organizations, and the private sector, which means building policies and frameworks for all of them, making it, we build our policies based on mitigation. We build the policies based on mistrust, and build the policies on solution frameworks. I think we need to start building a policies based on trusting the stakeholders and expecting them to behave and perform in particular ways. And reframing that kind of a thinking itself is important. And we have to, I would rather say that we have been building on what each person does not bring to the table. We always say industry pollutes, and therefore they're causing the problem. But I would like to reframe the discussion and the model into what does each person bring to the table? What do civil society organizations bring to the table? What do citizens bring to the table? And India, I think, is setting a model. If we talk of Jan Bhagidari, I think we can't limit the definition that Prime Minister talks about Jan Bhagidari just to citizens participating in state programs. It is much deeper, like what Famida said, where citizens actually take ownership, custodianship, responsibility for delivering on all these things that we talk about. And if that happens, I think there's a natural consequence is going to be the life economy.
Thank you. Thanks, Balaji. Let me turn to you, Christina, now to take that conversation forward. More in terms of the paradigm shift that, as a question I posed to Balaji and he responded. I think now the issue before us is in terms of how this paradigm shift that we are talking about under SDG Goal 12, we have already talked about sustainable consumption and production. what kind of issues are coming in when we talk about the lifestyle for environment, when we are already discussing sustainable consumption, sustainable production, the idea of circularity? Do you see a fundamental change happening, both as Famida said, at the individual level, at the systemic level, as Balu mentioned, and what we heard from Hirad in terms of adopting that change and adopting that at a larger level? Do you see that the trend is emerging now in terms of we going towards that new paradigm of development?
Thank you, Professor Sachin. Thank you to all my panelists here with me. First, I'd like to thank India for inviting me to this panel. It's been a pleasure to stay here in Kerala for the past week, enjoying the calm of the backwaters and engaging in Sherpa negotiations, which are trying to find some possible common ground between our countries. I was particularly happy to be invited to this panel on LiFE. Since we need urgent action on climate, I don't need to reiterate here the dire situation that Mr. Avinash has shown us. We are right now at the midpoint of the 2030 agenda, and we are off track to get it. So we need to bring concentrated efforts to really scale up efforts on it. I think that LiFE, it's deeply embedded in the agenda we already have right now within the 2030 agenda. It has a close relationship with SDG 12 on sustainable consumption and production. It could be a direction to follow to moving forward. We have to strengthen the collection of data, as was shown in our first panel this morning, so we can instrumentalize public policies that are conducive to LiFE. For example, on target 12.5 on waste reduction, we've seen here the beautiful work that is being done in India this morning in the presentation by Mr. Siddharth Handi. And in Brazil, we are also scaling up efforts on it. We have a national solid waste policy that we share the responsibility of waste collection between states and producers. So we try to get them together, and we've managed to get some success, and 74% of municipalities in Brazil have some type of sorting program of waste. Another example that we can have within the SDG 12 framework is the target 12.7 on public procurement. And it actually has this is a very interesting one, because it has a doubly positive effect on public procurement. Because on the one hand, it encourages consumers to demand greater degrees on sustainability. And on the other hand, it also incentivizes producers to try to have more sustainable production patterns. Another example that we could bring also is on target 12.8, which is to bring awareness in relevant information. So for example, we could have a seal of energy efficiency on items, so consumers can make better informed choices, and they have more information, so they can have better, more sustainable choices. And this is a way where the public sector and consumers can work together to try to achieve more sustainability. Right now, we are at the midpoint of the 2030 agenda, and we are off track to achieve it. This year, we have the India G20 presidency that is bringing this forward to the agenda. We also have the SDG summit going on at the UN in September. So this is a very special moment to try to scale up efforts, both on the broad 2030 agenda and SDG 12 in particular, which India has wisely put up front center in their agenda. We are negotiating the action plan to accelerate progress on SDGs and the high-level principles of LiFE. So we have our work set up to us right now for the next few days. We'll see how we're going to advance on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Christina. I think with this first round, we have done pretty well with our time. We still have around 20 minutes. So let me start with you, Christina, back in terms of how what you just now mentioned in terms of the sustainable consumption, production, the energy efficiency, and also data and evidence-based policy making. Do you see this becoming part of a multi-year discussion agenda in the development working group? Do you see that possibility now that Brazil would be taking over and take the agenda forward?
Yeah, we have a heavy mantle to carry for the next year, following up on this ambitious work and amazing hospitality that India is setting for us here. We have a very good context right now within G20 with 4 presidencies of emerging countries, with Indonesia last year, India this year, Brazil, and then South Africa. But also, as I've mentioned, we have a broad international context with the SDG Summit this year and the Summit of the Future next year. And also in my country, this is an exciting time in the development environmental agenda. We have both internal changes that we just had in our government right now. For example, our Ministry of Environment just changed its name to Environment and Climate. And within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which I'm part of, we just created a Directorate for Energy and Climate. And also we have a bid to host COP in 2025. So we are eager to participate in this agenda and to keep the momentum moving forward. We are also those 4 emerging countries in G20 presidencies. We are countries, we share many similarities. We work closely together, both here in G20 and also in other fora. I am particularly excited for next year when we have IBSA, Troika with India, Brazil, and South Africa. I think it's going to be interesting. So I think we have many common agendas in energy transition, in climate financing, in poverty reduction, and we'll definitely work very closely together to keep this momentum going forward in accelerating SDGs and pushing the climate agenda forward.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Christina. Our keynote speaker today, Professor Avinash, raised this very important point of raising local resources. And when we talk about globalization and localization, Balaji, I come across this unique initiative that you have provided leadership to in India of social sector stock exchange. And this was introduced, you are chairing the advisory committee to SEBI. How you see developing countries raising resources through social stock exchange? What kind of revolution is this? And in several countries, we haven't succeeded so much. So how you see this possibility in India?
Thanks, Sachin. I think it's a very new experiment. Even before a formal announcement of the LiFE economy was made, 2019, the Indian government decided that it's going to set up the social stock exchange. Like you said, 14 other countries have tried with, I wouldn't say complete failures, but differential levels of success is what I would put it. Whether it's the London Stock Exchange or different experiments in the US to now India, even small countries like Jamaica. Now, essentially, when you talk of the social stock exchange, what do we mean? The moment we say a stock exchange, we think it's a transactional entity which oversees trading. But essentially here we are not trading, we are listing organizations. So I would put them in 3 buckets: the supply side of the equation, the demand side of the equation, and the central regulatory piece. Today in the world of philanthropy, the way we understand it, it's also moving towards impact investing. But in philanthropy, essentially recipient organizations are self-accountable and not really held accountable. No, I declare my accountability based on my sense of good fairness and justice and all that. But in the social stock exchange, because the rigor of the intermediary entity called the regulator, where the demand is placed on the social enterprise. And in India, again, it could be a model, it could also be a problem. We're still debating it. Most countries have defined social enterprises, and in the international lexicon, we have 62 different definitions of a social enterprise. But in India, we don't have a definition for a social enterprise. You can create an NGO in India under several different laws, not necessarily one law. So with that kind of a space, we decided that at SEBI, the definition is if 67% of your activities can be accounted for as social, where the primacy of intent is social, then you are a social enterprise. You always need money, and financing is so inconsistent. We never get funds on time. We never get it continuously to actually generate social impact. Everybody talks of impact, but the instruments of finance to generate the impact is not available. The supply side is not there. So this social stock exchange enables a platform where the demand side system ecosystem is actually monitored, held accountable, they're listed and registered, and they're measured for performance. A new brand of social auditors are getting created. They actually measure social impact. The supply side, there's a reassurance from the exchange that your money is going to be protected. Their investment is risk covered. There's an intermediary which makes a risk investment. And then based on social impact that is produced, the investor actually pays for it. So it's sort of a win-win-win for all. And India collectively, governments, non-profit sector, all of us together spend close to around $440 billion. We'll be spending by 2030 if you have to meet the SDGs. But we'll need an equivalent amount. And that amount exists in the country, but generating the awareness to put it into these kind of sectors did not exist. The social stock exchange creates that space and platform and gives a structural advantage to operate it from. And if India succeeds, which I think we will, it can be a model not just for Global South, but the entire world itself.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Famida, let me bring you in now with this idea of focusing on what action we require at the global level to have sort of ecosystem for individuals. So how the globally designed projects, globally designed policies can deliver an ecosystem that is relevant for individuals.
Thank you. Yeah, when we're talking about finance, so the financial architecture is such that particularly with regard to the environmental climate-related finance, so if you see the requirement, compared to the requirement, the available amount is far, far below. So that's one understanding. Second is that the available resources are increasingly biased towards mitigation activities rather than adaptation activities, which are the needs of the vulnerable countries, which are climate vulnerable. The third one is that also that the governments have limited resources, so they have to rely on the private sector. But if you look at the pattern of private sectors, they would invest in make investments in projects which are financially profitable, which gives good return. So it's always like they would be more enthusiastic in terms of investing in renewable energy, for example, rather than building a cyclone affected structure. So those things are, are kind of public good in nature. And the responsibility for looking at the public goods relies on the government itself. So now, and government has to look after the people. So the individuals at the grassroots level or at the individual level, they don't have access to resources unless and until the government has a flow towards, to the below. So what is happening, ironically, is that now countries which are graduating for least developed countries, so the financial flow will squeeze. It has already started. And so the finance for the non-government sectors and the COCs, that flow is also squeezing, reducing. So I see a real challenge how these organizations which are working at the grassroots level, who are in charge of creating awareness at the citizens level, at the individual level, how they're going to survive. That's a real challenge. And there, I think, resources have to be mobilized from various sources. I mean, at the international level, we have to think of, many financial instruments are there, but also some global resources, for example, aid for trade, typically which looks at the trade-related, funding. But how this can be also channeled or linked to the climate-related projects, we can quite easily do that. For example, support through this window, support to diversification of environmental goods and services, or cleaning the supply chain, all these that can be done on also capacity building. One thing has to be also remembered, that even if you have some sort of awareness, then where is the capacity, where is finance, where is technology? So all these three components have to be combined together for making a substantive impact at the grassroots level, at the individual level. I'll stop here.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Dr. Famida. Hirat, what do you think G20 can do in terms of taking the agenda forward? What we heard from all of our panelists, how they can take this forward? 1 minute.
Well, I think this particular year and this particular presidency has a unique opportunity to make a massive difference in terms of breaking out of the gridlock that the development sort of world is stuck in. And I think experiments like the social stock exchange that India has launched, and I was sitting next to Professor Avinash at lunch, and he was talking about a special economic zone in Barbados. I think basically by creating walled gardens, spaces, policy and fiscal spaces within the economy where we develop the nurturing ecosystem, the enabling environment where LiFE businesses that exist to optimize benefit for people and planet can thrive and can be on a level playing field. I think that's a bold agenda that the G20 can take on and start with the existing legal frameworks that have been passed across 17, at least, of the countries, map what the LiFE economy looks like across the G20, harmonize the definitions around these legal frameworks, assess what kinds of regulatory and market barriers these enterprises are facing, and put together basically national plans to recognize and find solutions to those barriers, engage all the stakeholders at the national level. This is an agenda that could be done in 3 phases. The first year would be a process of the countries committing to mapping and defining the LiFE economy within their countries, engaging stakeholders and doing that, identifying the values and principles that should inform the definition, harmonizing definitions. The following year, you can go deeper and start looking at enabling policy and regulation. You can look at metrics and ways of making sure that there's rigor in the impact performance and the accountabilities organizations. And then I think in a third year, you can start to shift finance in a major way. Once you've built the infrastructure essentially of a LiFE economy, now you're able to move resources towards that new space. And the 40 million startups each year that are social purpose have enabling infrastructure, development finance in all its forms can start to flow in that direction.
Excellent. And I think then we can take that forward, what Dr. Famida was mentioning in terms of new measurement milestones that we would be discussing tomorrow on the boat ride, going beyond GDP, and with Federico and OECD, we have been working on that. Colleagues, we still have 2 minutes, 3 minutes now with us. Is there any clarification from the floor or any observation from the floor? So the floor is open now. Any of the G20 delegates who are there for the DWG, if they want to have any observations, I would give them priority. Any clarification, observation? Federico, were you raising your hand? No. Okay. If not, then yes, Mr. Tadas here. And I see one more hand there. Yeah. Just behind you.
Thank you. In fact, it was very enlightening to listen to all the esteemed panelists here. As we all know that the existing growth models have been unsustainable, and the consensus is that we need to move towards sustainable developmental models. And LiFE indeed is a profound concept, and it also requires a very transformative approach in terms of how we look at trusteeship in terms of how we conserve resources and pass on the resources without any further sabotage or deterioration to the next generation. So we also need to deal with the intergenerational equities. And this requires a fundamental shift in our approach to consumption and production and adopting the new economic systems, especially the reference to the social enterprises and the new economic systems. I think this is where the areas we need to look at in a very deeper way and look at the policies, regulations, which will be conducive to this new way of thinking about growth model.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Tadas. I don't see any more hands. So what I would do is, okay, 10 seconds.
I'm Uday Shankar. I've been part of this banking transformation which happened in India as a model. And I submitted my paper to T7 Japan and they have accepted it. So I just want to mention a few lines about what happened actually. The way, see, any transition has to take people also along with them. The best example is how we went about forming groups, self-help groups in India, and then took them along with the institutions that we actually had with us, the NGOs. The NGOs worked with the people, took them to the next level, and then took them again to the next level, which is the small finance banks in India. So that was the ultimate where people could grow from a lower level, where they were forming groups and going on their own, got interpolated into a system called, non-finance banks, and then they became small finance banks. This was a very good model for, which India has floated now. This can be used for just transition into the green transition. That's what I wanted.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Let me just quickly turn back to my panel. For half a second, we are really running out of time. Only 41 seconds are left for our session. So I would very much like to start with Hirad and then go further up. Just half a second. Whatever closing remark, just very first.
I would say please be bold because the time is urgent and the window is small.
Be bold. Great, Hirad. Thanks a lot. Dr. Famida Khatun.
I would say that cooperation is the key because green lifestyle also involves cost.
Green lifestyle, excellent. Be bold, green lifestyle. Dr. Balasubramaniam, what's your keyword?
I think I would see development as a freedom of choice, and we should choose a life economy.
Excellent. Thank you. Salas, to you.
I know I was supposed to be very brief, but just one small note that I would like to commend India on the effort of trying to be inclusive, both in terms of gender and regionally in the choice of your panelists. So I have to commend you on that. And we have to be decisive.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot. I must thank my panel. I need not summarize it. I think the key words that they have spoken at the end are the most powerful ones. They have summarized themselves. I thank for this opportunity to have this side panel and bring to you several ideas in terms of how G20 may be bold in terms of making the development choices that we have, and those choices are extremely limited. We have to be environment friendly. We have to have lifestyles which are environment friendly, which are green, and which are individually relevant, and of course, gender balance. So I close with this. Thank you.
Let's have a big round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, for our moderator and our eminent panelists. And I'd like to invite the WG co-chair, Ms. Enam Gambhir, to kindly join us on stage and felicitate our esteemed panelists with very small tokens of our gratitude and appreciation. Can we please have the mementos on stage? Let's have a big round of applause for our moderator, Professor Sachin Chaturvedi. A big round of applause for Mr. Hirad Sabeti. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Famida Khatun. Dr. R. Balasubramanian. And a big thank you to Ms. Celeste Cristina Badaro. Another photographer will need a group photo opportunity. Thank you once again to our eminent panelists, and thank you, Ms. Gambhir, for doing the honors. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And now with that, ladies and gentlemen, we will shortly have a panel discussion on just green transitions, comprehensive integrated approach. But before the discussion, we will begin with a presentation on just green transitions by Mr. Giuseppe Di Simone. And then we will request Mr. Giuseppe to be a part of the panel discussions as well. Let me take a moment to introduce Mr. Giuseppe Di Simone, who is a Strategic Planning Officer at the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO. He is the lead coordinator on G20 matters, as well as responsible for other strategic planning work in UNIDO. Prior to his work in strategic planning, he worked mostly on sustainable energy issues, from project management to research and policy perspectives, both in UNIDO and the International Atomic Energy Agency. I'm going to request him to kindly join us on stage. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Mr. Giuseppe Di Simone. There he is. Welcome, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thanks the co-chairs for the kind invitation. Today, I will try to briefly frame a very vast topic, which has important implications for our lives. We heard some aspects of it in the previous panel, and we know how central the theme of bridging the perceived gaps between development and environment and climate protection are existing for the new for the current presidency. So I would like to start with a few slides to just frame this issue. So first of all, a little bit the rationale. Why are we talking about just green transition? This has been identified by the current presidency as one of the transformative transitions in the proposed G20 action plan on accelerating SDGs. And we know that we know why. It's very, very clear why. In particular, the climate emergency, but we know that we have a triple planetary crisis going on, and particularly climate emergency implies immediate action, and we have to change the way we do things, the way we grow, the way we produce and we consume. So we need a green transition, right? And what we need is a systemic transformation. It is, of course, it will be a mix of disruptive and marginal gains, but we need to change quick and pretty radically the way we do things. So we need an economy-wide transformation. And then what we know is that this will generate winners and losers. And we'll talk about destructive creation. So there will be losers for sure. So we need it to be a just and green transition. In the box there, what you see is that is a little bit of a simple way of looking at things. It's not a matter of if we're going to have a transition or why or where. We know it's a global issue. We know it's going to touch on all of us. And we know why it's happening. And it's mostly because of our fault, right? So we need to decide. It's on us. It's the bold action that we're being called on taken by the previous panelists and by experts all around the world. It's on us to say how quickly we can make this transition, when, how, what, and who will be part of it. So how inclusive this can be. Of course, we're not starting from scratch, and many of you here are very familiar, and some of you have been involved since day one in many of the UN and otherwise multilateral discussions on these topics. We know the UN agencies have worked hard on that, and there are synergies, and there is a good basis to start on. When we talk about the just green transition, there are several different definitions. They tend to be a little different. Some talk about green transition, others talk about just transition. The G20 this year is addressing a just green transition. And that let us keep on the common, stay on the common elements. There is an urgency. Inclusion is fundamental. Adaptation and preparedness. There is a very important and urgent need for collective action. And of course, the G20 is in a unique position. So this graph here is just another one, because we've seen several over the years. This is the science. This is from the latest IPCC report, so I'm not breaking any news to anybody. We are off track to keeping the global warming within the desired 1.5 degrees. We are really off track, so we really need to radically improve the way we are dealing with this topic and stop postponing or asking others to take action. We all have to take action. I am from the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, so our focus is on the productive sector, and we know that we are a big part of the story. We heard Ambassador Kant, the G20 Sherpa, talking about industrializing without emissions, without carbonizing, which is the ambition of India, it's the ambition of developing countries, and we know that it is industry is a part of the solution, but certainly is part of the problem. So what we need to do is have an industrialization that is inclusive and it is sustainable. We know that about 30%, if you include energy emissions associated with industry, is coming from industry. So we have to tackle the industrial policy dimension. This model is just a way of putting in a scheme. This is adapted from the ILO guidelines on just transition. It's just a schematic way to let you understand the complexity of things, and the complexity is part of the reason why we're slow in implementing this, because we have to go across different sectors. You see them on top. There are different means of implementation. That is what is in the middle. There is an urgent need for policy support, capacity building. We heard it in the data for development discussion, but it is extremely true also for productive capacities. We heard our keynote speaker today talking about the financing needs, and I'm not going to repeat that. And on technology, of course, there is a huge work to be done. So we have a multidimensional approach that we need to consider, and we need policy coherence and the right institutional arrangements. So how do we make this transition just? We know that we have to go towards a green economy. So how do we make this transition just? So the main point here is to leave no one behind. Very easy to say, not so much to actually implement it. Of course, there is a job dimension that is to be considered. We know how important job creation and job retention is for all countries, not only developing countries. Mind here, we're talking about development, but this issue of the just green transition is something that affects all countries, including G20 countries. So we need to make sure that jobs are preserved, that skills are developed, and the workforce is ready for the transition, and the losers are supported. Of course, there is an international dimension to that, and it's also within the countries, not only about a matter of jobs. It's a matter of, again, access to finance, technology, knowledge, and capacities. It's very important to protect and empower segment of society who are more likely to lose out. I'm talking about youth. I'm talking about women. We heard earlier some mention into it. And of course, there are countries who are more vulnerable, and it's not even their fault, right? They are the most exposed, and it's not that climate change depends on the emissions that are coming from several of these countries. And mind that we talk also about pollution and biodiversity loss. A key point here is policy integration. I'm going to touch on that perhaps later on if I have a little time. But it is very important, which is what the presidency is doing this year, to bring together the development discussion, the economic growth discussion with the climate and environmental discussion. It's absolutely central for if we have any chance to succeed. In the end here, we're talking about sustainable development. We're talking about an inclusive and sustainable way of growing and staying within the planetary boundaries. Globally, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a global transition. It's not that some countries can advance and others can stay behind and we will forget about them. We can only be as fast as the slowest country in enjoying the transition. This is something that is unavoidable and that we should embrace it and move together and make sure that knowledge is shared, financing is provided, technology and capacities are given to all countries. There are great challenges that, of course, I'm not going to list here. Those of you dealing with development are very familiar with these matters. So in the interest of time, I will skip it. I would like to introduce a little bit of a shift in the narrative here. There is a lot of negative or a lot of emphasis on the challenges when we talk about these matters. In reality, there are great opportunities. There are great opportunities for all, for developing countries as well. By adopting sustainable practices and technologies, you embrace higher levels of productivity, decent jobs, and higher paid jobs can be created. Of course, certain things need to be in place for that to work. Policies, again, capacities, etc. And again, the interconnected nature of our economy and our world implies that we really need to act together. And the G20, again, can do much here. The G20 action plan can actually be one of the most important elements to push. There is a lot of work that is out there. We need really that big, bold push so that action is taken. We need a shared understanding. The discussions these days will clarify what the G20 means for a just green transition. But it's going to be around the lines that we heard before. We certainly need the G20 to increase the contributions, not only in terms of finance, but also in terms of capacities, policies, and technology for an integrated approach to this matters. There are solutions to the challenges, and we have opportunities to reap. So together we can achieve those. The DWG, of course, can bring in more than other groups the perspective of developing countries. There are certain areas for action of the G20 which we are highlighting on this slide. I'm already long, so I'm not going to dwell too much on that, but I understand that the slides will be circulated with you. The proposed G20 action plan includes certain areas of activity which certainly we can look at. The means of implementation that I mentioned before are, of course, important here. Important here is to bring on board the private sector as well. There is a lot that can be done through the global value chains and regional value chains, and perhaps some work can be done in this area as well. The international environment is there to support, needs the support of G20 countries, need G20 countries to take this work seriously. And as this presidency is pushing all of us to think along those lines. So let me commend the Indian presidency for moving in the right direction. And this, I will thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for that wonderful presentation. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm requesting him to kindly be seated on the dais because we start with the panel discussion. Let me now invite on stage our moderator for this discussion, ladies and gentlemen. May I invite Ms. Sunena Kumar, Senior Fellow at Observer Research Foundation and Executive Director at Think 20 India Secretariat. Welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, to introduce her briefly, she's been a journalist for over 15 years and has reported on development, gender, and culture. She has worked as a senior editor with the Indian Express, Open Magazine, and Tehelka, and has contributed news features to The Guardian and BBC, Al Jazeera, India Spend, and Mint, amongst others. She's also written on India's foreign policy for the European Council on Foreign Relations, and as an independent journalist, she has reported on a variety of subjects from different parts of India, Germany, and Bangladesh. Very warm welcome once again. May I now invite back on stage Professor Avinash Persod, Special Envoy to the Prime Minister of Barbados on Investment and Financial Services member, IHLEG, on climate finance. Ladies and gentlemen, though he has been introduced earlier, but for those of you joining us now and also for viewers online, Professor Persaud has published widely on finance and economics and has served on a number of major policy commissions, including chairing the Warwick Commission and the Regulatory Subcommittee of the UN Commission on Financial Reform. And he was also an expert member of the UK Treasury's Audit and Risk Committee and the Pew Task Force to the US Senate Banking Committee. Welcome back again. Let me invite on stage Ambassador Manjeev Singh Puri, Distinguished Fellow TERI. Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for Ambassador Manjeev Singh Puri. He joined the Indian Foreign Services in 1982 and has served as Ambassador of India to the European Union, Belgium, Luxembourg, Nepal, and as Ambassador and Deputy Permanent Representative of India to the UN. Also, major areas of his experience and professional focus relate to the environment, in particular climate change and sustainable development. Ambassador Puri was a lead negotiator for India at the UN on issues relating to post-2015 development agenda, sustainable development goals, and at the UN Conference on Sustainable Development held in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil in June 2012. He was also a key member of India's delegation at various climate change negotiations, including the Conference of Parties of the UNFCCC in Copenhagen, and before that at Montreal, Bali, Bonn, and also Poznan. Welcome again, sir. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, let me invite Mr. Ratish Balakrishnan. He's the co-founder and managing partner at Sattva Consulting. Mr. Balakrishnan builds functional and sectoral expertise at Sattva and leads the Sattva Knowledge Institute, Sattva's official knowledge platform. He has worked with several foundations and non-profits across India, Africa, and Southeast Asia on conceptualizing and implementing large-scale solutions. He also has expertise in building state capacity on a wide range of focus areas and enabling data-led decision-making by the government. Welcome. With that, I now hand over the proceedings of this session to our moderator, Ms. Sunaina Kumar. Ma'am, take it away.
Thank you. And thanks for that very kind introduction. Good afternoon to everyone. We are here to discuss just green transitions, a comprehensive integrated approach. That is the panel. And well, we are here to discuss also the role of the G20 in delivering the promise of a people-positive just transition for all. Social inclusion, prosperity, and decent jobs while delivering climate goals is at the crux of just transition. However, every country has their own economic, social, and environmental conditions, and so every transition is going to be country-specific. But there are common challenges facing developing countries that hold them back from realizing a just transition. And these span finance, technology, and capacity building. Of course, we've heard a lot of that in our keynote speeches as well today. To get past these challenges, global cooperation will be necessary. And to discuss some of these questions, we have a wonderful panel. We will be opening this up to the audience just at the end. And for now, I'm going to jump straight in. Professor Persaud, I'd like to begin with you. And I'm going to ask you the classic question on just transition, which is how can we create just transition that also allows developing countries to achieve economic growth? What is the development paradigm that the G20 needs to focus on to reduce the trade-offs between development, environment, and climate agendas based on the principles of justice and equity?
Well, it's a critical question. The reason why the green transformation is not happening in developing countries is because it's very costly. And it's not good enough to say that green renewable energies make money. They make money in certain environments. They make money when the cost of capital is as low as it is in developed countries. They actually don't make money in emerging and developing countries. And then that's assuming we start off with a clean piece of paper. But what about the costs of the transition of decommissioning existing institutional infrastructure? What about the social costs of that transformation? We're talking about trying to support a major transformation in South Africa out of coal, one of the world's largest producers, consumers per head of coal. Well, imagine you switch. What happens to that that mining town, what happens to those 45-year-old, 50-year-old people who are going to find it very costly? So in environments where transitions are costly, we need an external solution. And it makes sense that there's an external solution because we're accelerating this. If it was to happen at its natural pace, it would happen, but it would happen slowly, and it would happen too slowly for the planet. So if the planet and others want us to move at a different pace than is natural, then we need some external support. And that's why, we have been proposing that we need to lower the cost of capital in investing in these projects so that it's as profitable as investing in it in Germany, as it is in India, in Vietnam, in Indonesia, and South Africa. And what is the cost? Why is there this huge cost difference? And the IEA and others have done great work on that, on the cost differences. They're huge. Doing a project, a renewable energy project, I'll be quick. It's between 25% in Africa and 2% in Germany. That's huge. It's all the difference. So we need an agency that has a substantial amount of capital and liquidity, whose job it is to guarantee a international rate of return. And I believe that it's actually commercially viable to do that, because these risk premiums, if you like, could be earned by the agency and turned into a global public good by lowering the cost of capital. But for that to happen, the agency needs to be diversified. It needs to be able to go through the good times and the bad times, so lots of capital and liquidity. We're calling it a just green transition financing investment trust. It needs to kick off with $20 billion or so, and it needs to have support from other existing institutions and make them bigger and bolder. And that's what we need to make this work. Thank you.
I do have a very quick follow-up question for you, which is really the perspective of small island nations which bear the brunt of the climate crisis. And of course, if you were to put that hat on, do you think that the G20 is making space for this agenda?
And many of you have heard me talk about green transformations, which of course are not really about small island development states at all. In fact, one of the reasons I think that our program of ideas has credibility is we're one of the few people talking about something that does not benefit ourselves. The just green transformation will not take place in Barbados. We're not emitters. It will take place in India, in South Africa, in Indonesia, in Vietnam, in places like that. What the small island states need, because they're the canaries in the mine, is help for resilience building, and they need help for loss and damage. And those are actually the two smaller things we need. So the total number is $2 trillion a year. 1.65 trillion is transformation. $250 billion is resilience. $100 billion is loss and damage. But they're concentrated across different countries. The small island states needs a fund available for loss and damage, and needs help making sure they can be resilient today and not in 20 years' time. No point being resilient in 20 years' time. That's what they need.
Okay. No point being resilient in 20 years. Ambassador Puri, I'll turn to you now. One of the priorities of India's G20 presidency is reform multilateralism. And going by the gaps in previous global climate agreements, do we need to repurpose multilateralism institutions to achieve just transitions, keeping in mind different country contexts? That's one. And also, how can the G20 help in creating and enabling international framework to achieve this?
Sunaina, thank you very much. Thank you for the person who introduced me. So you all know here's an old guy who was around when it all began and has popped up here again. But things haven't changed, haven't they? They don't. That's the nature of the way international governance takes place. It's only the subject matter which has changed. And today we are focused on sustainability, and rightly so. Professor Prashad, I have no words to thank you for what you've said, because you've hit the crux. And I'll make a little small distinctions. One is, it isn't a macroeconomic question of quantity. global GDP savings rate is about $20 trillion. Requirements today for greening in the developing world and elsewhere is about $5 to $6 trillion. You have to move the monies. I have a slightly, let me say, slightly modified idea from yours, but completely along the lines that you're talking about. And that is what we call we should do out here because we can do it. I also want to make a few other points to you. You know, the G20, what is it? I mean, let's be a little, let me say, adults among ourselves. It's the place which provides polarity to multilateralism and a polarity which is inclusive and reflective of contemporary realities. Now, this is the polarity which allows you to come to decisions, in a sense, if I may say so, behind the scenes, for them to be regularized in a de jure manner in multilateralism. When all of this began, and I'm leaving out the finance minister's track and the Asian crisis, but when it started in 2008 with the heads of state and government, what happened? The ratifications happened at the BWIs, whether it was IMF or the World Bank. I'm therefore a little surprised that they're missing out here. They're the key to the elements. And they're the key to what you said, whether Prashad, money makes the things happen and money will make it happen. Of course, we need to change behavioral patterns. Of course, we need to understand, but hopefully those messages are getting through. I've prepared just 3-4 slides. I won't go through them all because I think much has been said, but just focus on this. Transition we must, but what is just? Just is not only about equal, it's about equity. I've eaten the entire half the tin of biscuits and it's come into the room. I should also get my own share. Certainly, sir, you should get your share. What about the half tin that you've already eaten? So please don't forget equity. And again, Professor Prashad hinted at it, said it quite beautifully in elegant language. Let us remember who is responsible for this cloud which is hanging over us and which has raised global temperatures and which is causing all the kinds of complications that we are thinking about. There is element of greed, but there's also element of the way the world developed. Can we really change it? We have to change it. But we have to change it in a manner that we can accept the change. Incrementalism is also an important element. When we look at green, let's look at the issues. Money, I'll come to that. Money is central, especially to this development working group. But let's look at technology. Let's stop demonizing things. Renewables, great, fantastic. There will be problems. Let's remember that. Let's not demonize nuclear. Let's not demonize new kinds of technologies which are coming. There are many things that people are talking about. I have deliberately written methanol. In India, it raises hackles. Regenerative agriculture. There's so many things. But don't demonize things. We need to perhaps move away in a very simplistic manner, if I say, away from the carbon-run world that we are looking at. Ma'am, let's look at the next slide. Whoever is controlling this. Yeah, people, of course, lifestyle is the most important element, sustainable consumption. But let's be smart. Because if you cut down, it has implications for growth. And there are serious problems. Let's not kid ourselves. I think my colleague from Bangladesh said it very well. There are costs to greening. And in the developing world, I'm afraid some of those costs are not so easy to simply look the other way. Again, I refer you to Professor Prashad and his mentioning debt as the solution to what happened during COVID. So think through these particular things. They are important because you have the polarity of power or the power of polarity here with you. And you can therefore affect what multilateralism will do de jure. And so you are very important. Let's go to money and let's just think about this thing. There should be no doubt. And Sunena, this takes me back to your fundamental question. What should be done with the multilateral institutions? I don't want to get into UNSC reform. It's about international governance. It's about power play. It's about hegemony. We all know that. We are sitting among the 20 most important countries in the world. We don't need to be told this. Having said all this, what can we do to sharpen those institutions so that they meet the requirements of today? I would ideally like reflect contemporary realities. But let's look at meet the realities of today. One thing is you need to start shifting the focus for money towards sustainability, climate, etc. It means taxonomies, it means easing the norms at which it happens, but above all, it means try and lower the cost of capital from the developed world to the developing world. And I'm willing to stick my neck out and say private capital to private ventures. Governments will never be able to fit this bill. And the fundamental little specific area, sir, I would leave with you is to create at the World Bank institutions a hedging agency, which does first loss guarantee, but basically hedges the currency risk. And if you can reduce it from the current levels, and if I tell you the figures of India, many of you will be surprised. It more than doubles or triples, even for a large economy like India. If you can hedge that, you will find a solution, a small partial one, but an incremental forward move. And that's what multilateralism can deliver, perhaps deliver in the current scenario itself, without looking at tectonic changes to what should happen. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Ambassador Puri. I do have a question based on what you just said, which is, and if you can answer this quickly, which is, you talked about G20 being the 20 most powerful countries in the world and this whole idea of power politics. How can India ensure, and do you think there is a risk that the broad development agenda that India is trying to put forward with the G20, and that includes just transitions, is there a risk that it could be overshadowed given the geopolitical crises that are dividing the G20 nations today?
So, Naina, that's the $1 million or the $1 trillion question of today, isn't it? So my answer is quite simple. Two things I want to make quite clear. I am fully convinced of the poly crisis. We know it. They're there in front of us. I'm also fully convinced that there are almost intractable political issues. But I also believe that there is a will in the world on the issue of sustainability, climate, etc. Focus on convergences. It doesn't mean we've forgotten the divergences. Focus on convergences. That, in my opinion, is a doable prospect, and it's something which we in India perhaps are in the best position to champion. Why? Because we are a country of the global south. And if we are able to do it, we will be able to leverage the abilities of the North, who also have a vested interest in this sustainability and greening for the common good of the global South, India included and larger countries included, but everyone. So I do see a true opening in this matter.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Balakrishnan, so at the heart of just transitions is the idea of livelihoods from the time it would have started as a labor movement. And my question to you is three-pronged, and we don't have that much time. But first is, how can we build capacities for skilling and reskilling of workers in the green economy? How can we ensure that women who bear the brunt of climate change are able to both participate and benefit from green economy? And what is the role that the private sector, which you are representing here, can play in this?
No, thank you for the questions, and it's a pleasure to be here. I want to step back from the skilling question itself, Sunena, to broadly talk about human capital development. Because what we are asking in general is, given the crisis and the opportunity ahead of us, how do we build the right human capital that is required to solve this crisis? In my mind, that depends on two things. Yeah. The first thing is, what is the ambition with which we are approaching this crisis in the first place? There is a lot of argument around, let's do no harm. Let's make sure no one gets hurt. For that situation, I think you will build a certain type of human capital. But if you're going to transform that question into, how do I make this an opportunity to create value for people at large, for them to thrive, then the human capital requirement is very, very different. And I think the conscious choice countries in the global south like India are taking is the latter. We are not just saying do no harm. We are saying for our youth dividend, how do we make this into an opportunity How do we create sufficient value and jobs for people? And I think that's an important question for us to answer before we ask ourselves, what do we do for skilling? And I think the second nuance is really, for what are we skilling for? Because many countries have approached this as a supply side problem, focused on skilling, not knowing what the demand side looks like. And there for me, there are three important choices. The first choice really is the emerging sectors that are becoming very relevant today, which is things like energy and mobility. What kind of jobs are they creating? There is a risk of them creating a U-shaped job curve where you have highly unskilled jobs or very skilled jobs and not enough jobs in the middle. Then to be honest, not much skilling is going to help. So how do we define business models in the new industries that create jobs in the middle where skilling can unlock value, I think is an important choice. And I think one of the priorities for countries is to define those industries in a way that create mass thriving, not just one, right? That's first choice. The second choice is, how do we look at our existing industries transforming to achieve and address this challenge? 40 million people work in the energy industry. If you look at other industries overall, it's 1.5 billion. So for countries like ours, it's the construction industry that's actually going to create value. It's going to be the manufacturing industry. It's not just the green sectors as we call them. And there, I think there are important choices on how do business models evolve to create value for the society and value for the environment. And I think that's a business model choice. And the last point is, I think what Sir rightly said, which is consumer choices and what was discussed in LiFE. How do we rethink our consumption models and our consumption industries? For me, it's really four questions. Where we live, how we move, what we eat, and what we buy. These four choices have to transform and create newer models for us that will create skill capacity and requirement. It is not just about addressing existing market models with our skilling. And when you put the options as these, you can imagine the capacity and skilling has to really be much different from what we are thinking of right now. Right? So these three things, which is how do we look at creating a more equitable job curve for people in the new industries? How do we transform our traditional industries, and how do we transform our lifestyle choices that create new jobs? I think is important. In the light of that, I feel four priorities are critical from a skilling or a human capital development perspective. The first is definitely to upskill existing workforce. How do we take people who are in jobs today, maybe in an ICE to an electrical mobility, to someone who does an X type of job to Y type of jobs across industries, traditional and new? That's number one. But I think something that often gets not noticed enough is the idea of credentialing. Today, in one of the presentations, it was told that 60% of our workforce is informal. And what we recognize when we do go deeper is most of the skill demand for solar power is actually today in construction industry. Most of the demands that we have in electrical mobility is going to come from existing industries that are mechanical. And hence, credentialing informal talent to be able to recognize their skills they've gained not by education, but by work, but by prior experience, I think is important. And I think in my mind, all developing nations should build a scalable model of credentialing people that is digital, verifiable, and globally recognized, in my opinion. And I'll come back to the talent question in a bit. But I think credentialing is an important priority for human capital development. I think the third priority for us is to really build entrepreneurial thinking in people. Start with schools, right down to colleges, because honestly, the skills we need in the future, we don't know yet. So learning to learn, ability to find value is going to be important. And hence, when you look at the broader ambition, entrepreneurial thinking built into the models in which we work, I think is going to be very, very important. And the last part is a question that you asked me, that if we believe a more equal and not an equitable approach will work, the women are going to be left behind, people with disability are going to be left behind, and hence an equitable model requires us to look at some of the normative changes we need to make. I was talking to a leading woman entrepreneur, and she told me this interesting line. She said, if you want to enable opportunities for women, focus on 3 M's: mobiles, minutes, and mobility. Essentially, what she's saying is, in an increasingly digital environment, access to devices is going to be important, access to data is going to be important, and ability and agency to move and to be mobile is going to be important. So to your gender question, I think mobile, minutes, and mobility. And if we don't shift those things like care economy, we can create as many jobs and we will still be surprised why women are not in the workforce. And I think somebody said this in the morning, a key indicator for sustained economic growth is women in the workforce, right? So that is probably the summary I would have, which is 4 priority areas for human capital development, which is upskilling of our existing workforce, looking at our current school, college education to improve entrepreneurial thinking, establishing a globally recognized digital scalable model of credentialing informal workforce for them to unlock opportunities in the new economy, and finally addressing the 3 M's for mobile, minutes and mobility for women so that they partake in this opportunity. I'll just close with the one last question on what is private sector going to do. For me, the question on skilling really depends on the demand creation on the private sector side. For them to be able to recognize and create models that are economically viable and socially equitable, I think is going to be important, number 1. And number 2, the kind of finance that is required here, and I agree with sir here, is definitely private capital. And the role for bilateral or multilateral or public capital really is to reduce the amount of risk that the private sector can potentially take, because it is their investments that's going to unlock value for their benefit and for our benefit. And those 2 aspects, which is designing the demand and unlocking the right finance, I think is going to be critical for private finance to enable this.
So all of this that you mentioned, is there a replicable model, say from India, that you can think of and share with us over here?
There are a bunch of interesting things that India is doing that I think are very relevant. Now, when I talked about the 4 choices of where you move, how you eat, etc., there are the challenge with you can always say, hey, listen, we need to reimagine these models. Where do they come from? 9 out of 10 startups are going to fail. But some of the public rails that we are building through digital public goods in India, I think are interesting lessons for different countries to look at. Like the open network for digital commerce is reducing the cost of starting a new business where new businesses can thrive for responsible choices. We are currently working on a digital credentialing system that potentially can enable informal workers to unlock their experience to economic value. There is models like Auken that is enabling credit, open credit enablement network. And I think opportunities and rails like these are global best practices that once proven in countries like India can be taken abroad. And I think that's worthwhile to look at. I think the second movement that has started in India is this focus on cultural enterprises. How do we look at cultural enterprises that create far more equitable value to thrive on digital rails that potentially every country can look in their context as well? And I think that is important as well. So those are 2 items I would highlight as best practices.
Thank you. Mr. De Simone, the developed world achieved growth through industrialization and, of course, on fossil fuels. Yet, as the world moves towards renewable sources of energy, the developing world is expected to achieve growth without fossil fuels. How feasible do you think this is? What will be the technical requirements for it? And what are some of the things that the developed world can do to support the developing world to achieve this?
Thank you. Thank you so much for the question. Well, it's not a chance that this question is being asked during this presidency. Industrialization is one of the most proven ways of growing, right? All developed countries went through a stage of structural transformation of their economy through industrialization, and then they evolved. And the same holds today. Now, what we know today is that it is unsustainable the way countries have industrialized. It was unsustainable back then. We know now because now we're hitting a wall, right? We know we have science, we have the evidence there. Now, solutions have to be found. So the question is not is it feasible? Is how will it be feasible? Right? Because we are not going into a world in which we are not growing, in which we are not. We have to find ways so that we can do that within the planetary boundaries and within that. So I'm not going to repeat a lot of what has been said here because that's industrialization. That's inclusive and sustainable industrialization. What we heard, we need money, we need technology, we need energy that is clean. We need entrepreneurs, we need social inclusion, we need the private sector on board and all that, right? So these are elements build what we call inclusive and sustainable industrial development, and it's at the basis of one of the elements of SDG 9, and has of course ramifications across the. Now, something I would like to emphasize here is the policy dimension, right? I'm sorry, is the policy dimension, because imagine we have all the money, right? The 2 trillions, right? What are we going to do with it, right? Do we have the right global, regional, and national governance system in place to understand where the priorities should be, what we should do about it? Do we have the degree of understanding of the complexity of the matter so that we can actually use the huge amount of money, right? We heard it from Avinash earlier, in the right way, because if we fail, we will not have the money back, right? So important elements for us is, well, first of all, let's demystify industrial policy, right? In the past 30 years or so, 40, we've had, industrial policy has gone out of the development cooperation, the development discussion, etc. And also the growth discussion. Everybody's doing industrial policy, right? They call it in different ways, but that's what we do. That's everybody does, right? And when we support renewable energy generation, it's industrial policy, right? So first of all, let's acknowledge that, and let's acknowledge that industrial policy can only be effective if they are integrated in a broader approach to the economy that drives that green transition. So what you need is industrial policy that speak to the trade and investment policies. They obviously speak to the climate and environmental policies, and so on. Innovation is a huge element of this, right? There is a time dimension to these industrial policies as well, which need to be taken into account, which is the short versus the long-term approach to things, right? Developing countries need to be, we talk a lot about technology transfer, technology cooperation. Developing countries need to be in a position that they get ready to become, to move away from a pure technology absorption mode to actually be innovators. And the good thing is that there are lots of emerging economies who actually are already innovating and actually are facilitating the diffusion of these technologies within the global south and across. So these elements are very important. The policy dimension should look at, and here I'm referring to the previous panel here, should look at the demand and the supply side, of course, because what we're trying to do is change into a more circular modality, the whole economy, right? And of course, there are policy dimensions that are, there are policy issues that cannot be dealt with nationally only, right? All of these elements have global repercussions. Some of the obvious key priority areas is industrial decarbonization, right? We know that you have hard-to-abate sectors. We know that it's a bunch of them, and we know they are responsible for a huge amount of the GHG emissions. So if you fix cement, steel, etc., you can actually fix a lot of things. Now, there is a lot of transboundary elements to that, and what we need is cooperation across countries there. In a moment in which countries are not cooperating too much, right? And we see also when we look at other sectors, looking at innovative fuels, for example, another pillar of the Green Development Pact, for this year's presidency, countries are each one is looking into green hydrogen. Every country is looking into it, developed and developing, but they tend to do it on their own, right? As a building a competitive edge against others. What we need is more cooperation there, because this has important implications. We don't have the time to get to a place in which we will understand that we need cooperation. We need to move much, much faster. I'll stop here.
Thank you. I know Professor Pesot wants to come in.
I get completely our resentment about the problem, right? So Rich countries have got rich by polluting the environment. We can work out the contribution they've made to our warming climate by exactly how wealthy they are. They have a narrative that they're wealthy because they're ingenious, but they're wealthy because they've put stuff in the atmosphere. I get that. And so, we have some resentment now being told that this is what we have to do for the planet's sake. But I think that let us imagine a world in which the financing is there, that we are indifferent between continuing what we're doing and transforming. There's financing for the social costs as well as the infrastructure costs, the material costs. Should we do it? You know what? This is a really good industrial strategy. It's sustainable. It's efficient. It's inclusive. We don't need the same kind of grid-like infrastructure when we could go to remote renewables. So, and you know what? A big part that's impacting the productivity of our countries, health. And this stuff that we're putting up there is bad for our health, not just the planet's health, our health. India's health profile, China's health profile is being impacted by our current energy production and consumption. So we demand that the financing is there for us to accelerate this process at the pace the planet wants, but we should own this because it's good industrial strategy for us.
And my question to that, either to you or to Mr. De Simone, would be that is there a chance that if we are moving towards an era of deglobalization, that the agenda for just transition could be at risk? What we need is greater cooperation, and do we have that? And what is the role of deglobalization in this?
Not sure I heard all the question because the sound up here is a bit funny. So I understand that the question is about if we're moving towards an era of deglobalization. Tough question. Certainly, the recent crisis have exacerbated a trend. The recent COVID crisis, right, has exacerbated protectionist approaches in various countries. Question is how temporary they are, right? I can give you my opinion is that we are not, but what we're doing is refocusing a bit the globalization that we have based our past 3 decades or more on, right? So what has happened is that we know now that the free flow trade, etc., is not going to solve all problems in the world, right? We know that challenges are there. We know that it's true that value chains, global value chains, can bring advantages, but there are trade-offs as well. I mentioned earlier during the presentation the opportunities that are opened by this presence of value chains across different countries, from often from developed to developing countries, and that it's a huge opportunity for the private sector to push the things that policymakers are too slow to actually move. There are voluntary standards, disclosure of information that would greatly help solve some of the information asymmetries, and drive consumers towards demanding different things, right? As you were mentioning earlier. So what we also know is that we need better global governance around these elements, and we know that we need, as I mentioned earlier, that trade policies, and of course the WTO agreements will be important for environmental goods and services, of course, which represent often great opportunities for developing countries, but right now things are a little stalled, so we will need to move in that direction as well. And I guess it's a matter of fixing a bit the rules of the game of the globalization that we had so far, and try to make sure that we are not stuck. Developing countries are not stuck in paths that are not beneficial for them because of the past. So I mean, the COVID crisis had made it very, very clear immediately. It was clear that there was a manufacturing issue, right? We couldn't find, and nowhere you could find masks, PPE. You couldn't find, of course, medical equipment in general. So. And then what happened was the global value chain disruptions, right? So what happened in many countries, what you had is a refocus of these value chains who became more regional, right? That's adaptation, right? That's we heard earlier about an adaptive policy approaches to things. So more of that will probably happen, and there is also a need to increase integration within regions. Of course, Africa is moving strongly on the trade integration there. In the energy sector, there's a lot that can be done in Latin America, for example, and et cetera. I don't think I have a full answer to your question, but that's a little bit how I feel about it.
No, that helps actually. So before we open this to the audience, I'm going to ask one common question to all our panelists, and if you can keep your answers brief, about 2 minutes. And the question is that if you could point out 2 or 3 priority areas for the G20 to focus on, keeping in mind the challenges that developing countries face in achieving just transitions. We'll begin with you, Professor Prasad.
I think there's a small handful of things which are achievable individually and collectively transform the financial system. There are areas, you said 2 or 3, but maybe it's 3 or 4. There are doors that are beginning to open, and I think the Indian G20 presidency should shove them open. I think firstly, it's MDB reform. We need to double the amount of lending the MDBs are doing, and they can do that by using their callable capital and their SDRs. Secondly, we need an agency that does the currency hedging for the green transformation. And that's not just about energy, as was rightly pointed out. It's also about sustainable agriculture and other things too. But we need an agency that does massive currency hedging beyond the scale we currently have, hedging trillions of dollars and billions of dollars of investment. And thirdly, we need a new global tax to fund those things that there's no private sector revenue, there's no savings to be had, that are part of the just green transition, and also part of the loss and damage of our new climate. And there's a bunch of other stuff, but let me give other people a chance.
Thank you. I can't agree more. I think fundamentally, let's not forget one thing. The G20 is about taking actionable decisions and getting them implemented multilaterally now. It's not about thinking and philosophy. Yes, those are good ideas to have discussions and pontificate and articulate. Do what you have to do. What is the need of the hour, and focus on convergences, especially in the area of economics. What do we need now? We need to work on sustainability, climate, and money. That's what the G20's forte is. It should do that. And so therefore, this currency risk agency, that's what I would talk about. In terms of MDB reforms, 2025 is a signal year. There's a lot of action there, lots of things, callable capital, how you go about it, reforms and quotas, many subjects will come up. And so Naina, before I end, I just want to go back to your previous question. Let's not allow ourselves to be in any way detracted by this deglobalization and all this. Look, shortening supply chains, restricting technology availabilities are old hegemonistic actions. We all will do it, and everybody does it. Having said this, the genie in the current world of globalization is out as a result of communications, and that will not change. Therefore, we need to tackle this particular climate and sustainability conundrum that we are faced. We need to do something about it. Can we do it within the existing systems? Let's try. Because, it's very easy to talk about throw it all up. We don't think that's the way forward. Let's move in this direction. Technology, money, and people, I think, That should be the effort and the motto at the moment.
I'm going to double down on people again. I think we should not approach this crisis with a mental model of imagining that we have 10 billion stomachs to fill or 10 billion lives to save. We have to imagine we have 10 billion brains to solve this problem. So I think what G20 countries should do is to double down on developing people that can solve this problem. More entrepreneurial thinking, more transversal skills, and honestly, a global talent passport. The best people from everywhere should be able to approach the right markets to be able to solve problems. I think that will always, so to your question of globalization, we need more of it also on the talent space, where good talent gets recognized, provides greater incentives for people to skill themselves and solve the right problems. So a global talent passport is what I would advocate for us to do.
It's very hard to be in this manner, guys. With these four people next to me, they cover the ground pretty well. No, jokes aside, of course, the G20 can move the money, right? We know that, we said it, through the multilateral banks, but also, you know, by fulfilling the pledges that they already made, the 100 billion and all that. We can start somewhere. That is a good place. And that's commitments that already were made. So we don't have to reopen that kind of worms. Let's just move on because we know how complicated these negotiations are. So that, of course, one important thing. The other thing is, you know, the G20 action plan this year is moving in that direction, you know, addressing those gaps, right? So we talked about it. The capacity building is required. So you know, facilitating the dissemination of best practices, technologies, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not gonna go more in detail with that stuff. In general, what the G20 could do is improve its effectiveness on the broader global governance system, right? So beyond the announcements, beyond certain initiatives, there is a lot of influence that G20 countries collectively and individually can have in multilateral banks, in UN processes, etc. Right? If they all go behind one good idea, we can actually move a lot of things, right? And the G20 is a place for agility and for action, right? We were discussing earlier. The initial spirit of the G20 was about doing, right? And that's something that, of course, it's important that it keeps on going. And then, of course, there are multilateral. There is a lot of talking about, you know, supporting the multilateral system, enhancing, strengthening, reforming the multilateral system, etc. I guess one ask would be to walk the talk, right? To take these processes seriously, UNFCCC, et cetera, to actually make sure that we are speaking the same language across different forums, because it happens that sometimes countries have different positions on the same topic, depending on where you are. So that is something that can be certainly solved. And then if a solution can be found to the situation in Ukraine, it would be great. So we actually can think about these things that are very important. Thanks.
Thank you. This has been a very rich discussion, and you've heard the panelists. Please raise your hands if you have questions. There have been, yes. We're going to maybe take two questions together. So is there anyone else? At the back of the room, yes. Can we have a mic there also? Let's start with you, sir, and then we'll hear from her.
Yes, my name is Pedro Henriques. I'm from the European Union delegation from the European Commission. And I'm very happy to hear from you references and emphasis on reducing the cost of capital and the need to address the risk. But you are asking for a new agency. And my issue is why you don't look to what is already existing and with big success. Because at the European Union level, we have already 6 years of experience of what is called the European Fund for Sustainable Development, which is, his main part is basically for de-risking, using grants to pay for the risks of its through the guarantees. So this is now our main instrument, and this is the way you see it. We are working, it's not just European institutions, we are working with European Investment Bank and financing institutions from our different European Union member states, all working together. So we are going from thousands of billions from our own grants to hundreds of billions, using all together to achieve the trillions. So this is already happening. And this is really a very successful instrument. So maybe before saying, let's create a new agency, see in the field what is already working and successful.
Okay, maybe you would like to comment on that, but we'll just hear from the... Yes, that's what. So please, ma'am.
I'm Karuna Singh from earthday.org, the environmental NGO. We firmly believe that climate education is foundational to most, if not all, of the initiatives you are speaking about. And yet there's not enough emphasis placed on that. I would welcome your comments on what if something is being done, and what if it's not being done? Is it really as necessary as we think it is? Thank you.
Who should we direct that to? To you? But first, let's hear from Professor Prasad.
CX, to our friend from the European Commission, you know, let me assure you, all the models are not our ideas. But what you are doing, TCX and all those others, are very good things. But what needs to be done is on a grand scale. Many more currencies, much more amounts transacted, and done on a large scale so that it doesn't actually require grants. It would be akin to an insurance product. And that's what the G20 can achieve here. So, sir, you are pioneers, but you've been pioneers even in putting it up there. Yeah? So that's fine. I'll say my 2 bits on climate education. Ma'am, you're absolutely right. I think if we are not going to be aware, let me take you to Ratish's point and that of Mr. Balasubramaniam earlier, people. If you are not aware, if you are not conscious, if you don't realize, then I'm afraid we can incentivize, we can penalize, but frankly, we will not succeed. But it is my belief that quite fast, not so slowly, through the medium of communications, a sensitization of the people is certainly taking place. What we are possibly lacking is an infrastructural arrangement to make this sensitization actually work. My bit.
I can only add to that and re-emphasize, sir, what you said, which is there anything that can be said to be enough about raising awareness among people on the extent of the challenge and the root causes behind those challenges? I think what is important for us to build on that now is to start talking about what is to be done on top of it, not just at an individual lifestyle level, but as solution makers itself. But to your point, fundamentally agree that any amount of awareness we can build and any amount of agency we can create for people to solve the problem is always investment in the right direction in the current crisis.
Could I just supplement your response, your excellent response? I mean, firstly, it's fantastic that we have this happening. It's a good development. It's got capacity. It's not yet doing it. We don't yet have billions, hundreds of billions of dollars of revenues being hedged. And in my own personal experience of working with some of these institutions is, and we as a developing country, we often call it funny money rather than real money, because there's all kinds of conditions attached. The EIB is one of the most excellent international development banks, but they're very much focused on there being a European element to the project. And so I think that this entity could be a partner, a strong partner, maybe a founding partner, core partner of a more international agency that is very focused on that mission. I think the point on education is a great point. Awareness, as you said. I have to say, my fields of finance, awareness has never been enough. It's not that the world is not aware of our problems. And again, this may be too narrow a finance perspective, but we need to change the system. The system is incentivized. Everything that's happening today in our world is incentivized to happen. If we want to change the world, it's not just talking about it, it's actually changing, reorienting the incentives for a different world, one that is much more sustainable, especially with the LiFE agenda. Thank you.
Last word is yours.
Thanks. No, just a quick point on education. We all agree, I think. We all agree, and something that I think is important to differentiate here what education can bring. Education can be at different levels along the life of people, is not only to change awareness and the knowledge, right? But also the attitudes towards certain topics. Of course, the skills. There is an important discussion on reskilling, etc., that which touched upon before, and the aspirations. Right? If people want to aspire to own a big SUV, regardless to the emissions, because that's success, they will go for that. If we manage to shift those aspirations towards having a carbon neutral household, right? Zero waste, carbon neutral household, and of course the infrastructure is there to allow that. Then we could have that demand that can drive things in a certain direction. Because then also from the business and entrepreneurial perspective, it's a matter of opportunity, right? If you recognize that you have an opportunity in embracing just green transition models, then you're going to go for it, right? It makes economic sense, right? Maybe Avinash, that worked in the banking sector better than awareness alone, right? Cheers.
Thank you so much. Some very important ideas put forth by our panelists, some crackling thoughts. I cannot do justice if I were to try and sum it up. I'm just going to thank each of you, Professor Prasad, Ambassador Puri, Mr. Balakrishnan, and Mr. De Simone. And thank you to the audience for your keen participation, and of course to the G20 Secretariat for putting this wonderfully curated site event together.
Thank you, Sunena.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, eminent panelists. I request you to please be with us on stage. I'd like to invite DWG co-chair, Ms. Enam Gambhir, to please do the honors and felicitate the presence of our esteemed panelists, starting with our moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, may I request you to please help me thank our moderator, Ms. Sunena Kumar. Can we please thank Professor Avinash Persod? Ladies and gentlemen, Ambassador Manjeet Singh Puri. Mr. Ratish Balakrishnan. Mr. Giuseppe De Simone. And a photo opportunity. The photographer is going to need one. I request the eminent panelists and Ms. Gambhir to please give us a photo opportunity. And with that, thank you, eminent panelists, once again. With that, I will now request Ms. Enam Gambhir to please render the closing remarks. Ma'am, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Aishwarya. Thank you, panelists, speakers for both the panels. I agree with Sunena. It's very hard to summarize such enriching discussions. Each of the speakers has made such convincing case for why, how, and what we need to do. If only arguments were enough, with such amazing arguments, we would have been done with our work today. But as we all know, especially as government officials, change through the intergovernmental process like G20 is a slower and sadly for us, a much more boring process. And that, colleagues, is our job over the next couple of weeks and months. Let's hope we can get it done before the time runs out. Thank you very much once again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, buses will depart for respective hotels in just about 10 to 15 minutes, post which there is also a networking reception starting 7:30 p.m., 19:30 hours. So buses will again, vehicles will depart from the respective hotels for Taj Kumarakam Resort, where we have a networking reception and social event. And we request you, ladies and gentlemen, to please be a part of that. The HODs and delegates, I invite you. And ladies and gentlemen, then, of course, tomorrow morning, we start with the meeting. So those announcements will also be made at the networking reception and social event. But thank you very much once again for being an integral part of this side event. Thank you. This is your host, Aishwarya Singh. Thank you again.